Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm chapter 76, and it's a challenging subject because it deals with the wrath and anger of God. Psalm chapter 76. Now, we have sort of a uncomfortable tension when we talk about the wrath of God because oftentimes it is greatly misunderstood. And when we think about anger in general, usually our thoughts go to it's really kind of an unhealthy thing. But that's absolutely not the truth. In fact, I think that the opposite of anger is indifference. There are things that we really should be angry about, and we ought to give some thought to that. I mean, if I were to ask you, what really burns you up? What makes you angry? Well, you might say, when I'm mistreated, or someone offends my family, or something like that. But I think that we're having a difficulty in our world today where we're really becoming sort of insensitive to some of the tragedies in life. Most of the anger that we see on the streets or in the political realm is often fused by a lot of, I think, just a lot of well, I don't even know how to say it, mishaps. But if you think about it, there are things that really, really should upset us. You might talk about child abuse or things like immorality or abortion or women being beaten and abused. There's just a list, I think, that ought to cause us to be angry. There is such a thing as a righteous anger. Now, the difficulty is so oftentimes our anger is without cause. We get angry about just about anything, I think. And then secondly, it's again, not often controlled. It just gets out of control. And I've always said that when you're angry, you'll make the best speech you ever regretted, or you'll do things that you wish you should never have done. And so we have difficulty because of the way our anger is. And I want to make a contrast to you about the anger of God. And that's what Psalm 76 does. Let's read just a few verses, and I think that you'll get something out of this. In Psalm 76 and verse 7 and following, thou, even thou art to be feared. Now, hold on a minute. The anger of God ought to be feared because it's fierce. And what he is speaking about is the adversary and the enemies of God will be eventually swept away. You might remember that in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 7, for the great day of wrath is come, who shall be able to stand? In one sense, no one, absolutely no one, but on the other hand, only the saved, that is, who have been saved by the grace of God through the blood of Jesus Christ, will be able to stand. And so the anger of God is fierce, and it's to be feared. And I think we generally speaking, have been silent about the wrath of God. And again, I think it's because there's a great misunderstanding, because God's wrath is righteous, and it's righteous in the sense that it's also punitive. People are actually getting what they really, really deserve. And when people do evil things and wicked things, they ought to be justly punished. And we feel that that's rather taboo, and we ought not to speak about that, and we ought to be silent. And it just makes everybody uncomfortable when we think about the wrath of God being vented on those who deserve it. And so when we look here in verse number 7, the wrath of God, the anger of God ought to be really feared, because there are severe consequences to that, and nobody can resist it or stand against it. Well, let's read on. And who may stand in the sight when thou art angry. Well, nobody, I mean, absolutely nobody, with the exception those who are saved. And we're going to see that element there because it's rather interesting. Notice here, thou hast caused judgment. Now that's righteous judgment, and we just already said something about it. And a lot of times, you know, our anger really isn't righteous at all. It's not just, and it's not controlled, and it's not really because there is a real reason to be angry. I'm just saying that because so many times our anger is so displaced and it's so out of control, and it's not just overdone sometimes. Now, verse number 8, again, it is caused a judgment. It's a righteous judgment to be heard from heaven, and the earth feared. I want to tell you something. When that great day comes, there's going to be great fear when the wrath of God is dispersed. Numbers 9, when God rose to judgment to save. Now, here's the thing, isn't it? And here's the tension, I think. You see, God's wrath was to save those who were being unjustly treated, and it's the justice of God here is for to save those against the enemy and against people who abused and the people who did wrong. So there's an element of salvation in the judgment of God. Now notice in verse 10, surely the wrath of God shall praise thee. Now here I want you to think about this. If properly understood, we would praise the wrath of God. There is someone who is just, who will deal with people who do things that are wrong. And you should praise that when you see people being mistreated and abused and oppressed and treated horribly. We ought to praise someone who steps in and deals with that. The wrath of God should be praised against the evil that goes on. And there's the thing that's sometimes we just greatly misunderstand. There is a time, friends, that the wrath of God is the proper thing, the right thing for God to do. And so that's some of our thoughts today, and we ought to be thinking about praising God for his wrath, because he will deal justly with the evil that needs to be justly dealt with. Now that's some challenging thoughts, isn't it? But the psalmist, you know, brings us into some realms there where we have to give some deep thought to, and there are times in our lives that we ought to be really burned up about some things. And can I say it one more time? If we're not burned up, and that is burn up enough to do something about it, then it's probably a problem of indifference. We just don't care. And God does care. And he cares about injustice. And he cares about oppression. And he cares about people who are mistreated. And he will step in and deal with it. And we ought to remember that. And so we'll continue our study in the Psalms. I hope to see you this Sunday morning at the Columbiana Church of Christ, and we'll be meeting together then. And if I don't see you then, we hope to see you on Monday at noon. So see you then.